Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. Back with a forecast discussion today as we have an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 across parts of the Midwest into the Great Lakes region in the orange shaded region you see here. So that includes places like southeast Iowa, the northern half of Illinois, including the entire Chicago metro area under the gun for the greatest severe threat for today, and into far southwest Michigan, far southern Wisconsin, and northwest Indiana. So pretty widespread severe threat for today in that greatest enhanced risk area. There is an all hazards threat that does exist with this setup. Tornado threat is at a 5%. 2% surrounds that up into Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, but a 5% concentrated there across southeast Iowa into the northern half of Illinois. Likely to be compacted a little bit as we go into the day today. They left a little bit, this 5% area a little bit wider this morning due to a little bit of uncertainty in the overall initiating boundary position. When we see where that ends up in this afternoon, going into this afternoon, they'll probably trim that a little bit down to account for the area in the immediate vicinity of the surface boundary. We'll talk about the boundary here in a second, but there is a tornado threat with the greatest threat in the brown shaded region there, the 5% risk area. Damaging wind, though, going to be the greatest threat for today. 30% hatched area for significant damaging wind gusts in excess of 60, 70, 80 plus mile an hour winds. Those are possible today in the corridor there, especially within the red stippled region you see there that does coincide with the enhanced risk. So damaging winds are going to be the main threat with this particular setup, and we'll talk about why that is in just a second. Large hail, also a threat today across parts of Iowa. In the initial portion of the convective life cycle, large hail could be a threat, and so we do have that all hazards threat within that enhanced risk for today. Going to just focus on the enhanced risk for this video. We do have a couple other areas of severe threat today across the central high plains. Slight risks there from far southeast Wyoming into western Nebraska, northwest Kansas, northeast Colorado for a threat of damaging winds in that corridor as well. And then up here in the northeast, parts of New York into Pennsylvania, under the gun for a slight risk there as well, mostly a damaging wind threat and some isolated large hail in that risk area as well. But in this video, going to focus on the enhanced risk, as that has the potential to be a pretty significant severe weather setup for that region. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's take a look at our current upper air maps right now. This is what we have going on at 500 millibars. Not a whole lot going on across the country. Big ridge of high pressure here dominating the southern half of the country. That has led to some pretty active monsoon activity across the desert southwest, particularly Arizona. Yesterday, very active day across parts of the lower deserts of Arizona from Tucson to Phoenix. Big dust storm rolled through with some severe thunderstorm activity there as a result of this high pressure ridge centered near the Four Corners, shifting off to the east just a little bit today. But we do have a little bit of troughing to talk of across the northern half of the country, really the northern third of the country under this kind of long wave trough here, a couple little ripples within that flow. In particular, this jet streak back in here from the southern Canada corridor down into the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin. A little bit of a jet streak there, 40 to 50 knots of flow associated with this little shortwave trough that will be digging down into the northern portion of the country, the Midwest, into the Great Lakes region today, and that will be our main synoptic scale factor to initiate severe weather with today's setup. Very low amplitude feature, but that we do have some evidence that this is going to, even though it does have quite a low amplitude, lead to a little bit more of an MCS type setup for today. We'll go into why that's the case here in just a second. Because we have such a low amplitude feature here, not much to speak of at the surface, just a broad cyclonic flow across much of the plains here, not really a tight surface low to speak of at this point, but we do have some southerly flow here ahead of this broad cyclonic circulation here, this broad weak cyclonic circulation. And we do have this morning a complex of storms that has moved across the Dakotas into Minnesota and now Wisconsin that has dissipated. But this complex earlier shot out a little bit of outflow, and that outflow boundary is going to be critical for as far as initiating storms in today's setup. This outflow boundary is going to be our initiating boundary for today's storms. And let's take a look at the surface data here to show you where exactly that boundary is at the moment. So here we go, latest surface observations, and you can clearly see the wind shift across parts of Iowa. Southerly to southwesterly winds across parts of Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri into southern Iowa. And to the north, we have much more easterly to southerly flow here. So definitely a backing of the winds here to the north. And that is indicative of a boundary that is sitting right across here. Outflow, again, from the morning convection is sitting right here. And that is expected, again, to be our initiating boundary for today's convection. And the main reason why we are expecting to see a pretty quick transition to a messy mode is that storms will be initiating along this boundary. And you'll notice that the deep layer shear vectors are oriented very much parallel to the initiating boundary. Let me put up the 0 to 6 kilometer shear vectors here. So you'll notice our shear vectors across Iowa very much out of the west, pretty much due westerly at this point across Minnesota into Iowa, a little bit of a northerly component as you go farther to the south, but nonetheless mostly a westerly component, shear vectors here in the deep layer. You translate that to our surface boundary, which is located somewhere kind of right in this vicinity as well. As we talked about, shear vectors looking like that, very much almost purely parallel to the initiating boundary. So you're going to get updrafts to go up along to the north of the outflow boundary. Notice how we still have a very juicy environment to the north of the outflow boundary here. Dew points in the mid to upper 70s on both sides of the boundary. So we should get we should have a fairly robust environment even to the north of this boundary to support significant severe weather. So we'll have storms going up along and to the north of the boundary along the instability gradient, which is kind of housed along that boundary. When you have shear vectors, again, parallel to that boundary, that is going to allow for a lot of updrafts to go up along that boundary and stay in that zone of ascent along the outflow boundary to kind of, as a result, we'll get a lot of updrafts and a lot of congealing and interacting of these updrafts to quickly develop into an MCS that will ride along that boundary. This boundary is also going to heighten the tornado potential with mostly any QLCS circulations embedded in the line. Again, the storm mode is expected to quickly take a turn toward a more messy, more linear type setup, but we are expecting to see a few tornado warnings here, probably right along this boundary. So if you're going out to chase today, definitely you want to be sticking to this boundary, as that is going to be where our enhanced low-level shear is located, and the most robust tornado threat is going to be along this boundary. Again, we're not quite sure where this is exactly going to set up. Right now it's here across basically central Iowa into maybe just far western Illinois. I'll kind of draw it in a little bit better there. So it's right along this corridor here, and it may lift northward just a tad as we go into the afternoon today, given southerly flow to the south of this boundary, perhaps pushing it to the north a little bit. But nonetheless, it's going to end up somewhere in here, this kind of central to northern Iowa corridor, perhaps into northwest Illinois. That will be our favorite corridor for where that boundary is going to set up and where our greatest tornado threat is going to be, and eventually where that MCS is going to track. So that is what we have going on here at the surface. 850 millibars here. Let's go back up and take a look at that. Again, not much going on here because of how low amplitude this upper level trough is. We do have a little bit of enhanced flow here just out ahead of this little wave at 850 millibars, 25 to 30 knots of flow or so, but this is not going to be a day where we'll have really significant low level shear to deal with. And in any case, the more linear nature of the convection going to temper the significant tornado threat quite a bit. But because we have some enhanced low-level shear along the boundary, winds kind of back to the north of the boundary here, going from southerly to more southeasterly or easterly to the north of the boundary, that is enhanced low-level shear in that corridor right along the boundary. So that is going to help overcome the fairly weak ambient low-level shear to perhaps foster a tornado threat right along that outflow boundary. Let's take a look at some soundings from across the region here. This is the Omaha, Nebraska sounding from 12Z this morning, and this is a pretty favorable profile for significant severe weather already in place at 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time this morning. Robust instability already in place, 3,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE already in place at 7 a.m. That is pretty impressive, and that is expected to increase as we go into the day today as temperatures warm. We get continued low-level warm moist advection to keep those dew points up into the mid-70s. We'll continue to see temperatures warm into the perhaps 90s, perhaps mid-90s today, as we have very strong heating that is ongoing to the south of the boundary. Right now you can see very clear skies here, save for just a few wisps of cirrus across much of Iowa, but mostly clear skies here to the south of, and really to the north of that outflow boundary as well. So we're going to get modification on both sides, have a robust air mass that will foster significant severe weather development on both sides of the boundary. But again, the focus is going to be where that convergence is strongest along the outflow boundary. But the point is, very strong heating here, going to get those temperatures well up into the 90s to bolster that instability even further going into the afternoon. 5,000 plus joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE is expected. When you already have 3,000 at 7 a.m., you're probably going to get a couple thousand more joules per kilogram to develop as you get those surface temperatures up and the moisture to continue to flow into the region. Very favorable wind profile as well, even though the winds aloft are fairly weak. 500 millibar winds only at about 20 to 25 knots at this point, but still we have nicely veering wind profile with height winds at the surface. They're out of the southeast, veering to pretty much due westerly as you go to 500 millibars and even northwesterly up at 300 millibars. So a nicely veering profile with height, favorable for initial supercells and providing strong deep layer shear for a robust severe threat. About 40 knots or so of deep layer shear, effective shear there, and a profile that does support some tornado risk here. You can see the veering of the winds there in the lowest levels of the atmosphere, lowest kilometer or so, effective storm relative felicity in excess of 150 meters squared per second squared. So that again is going to foster a tornado threat, especially near that outflow boundary where locally enhanced low level shear is likely. But still, in this kind of a westerly to northwest flow type event, MCSs are favored, and especially in this case where we have the deep layer shear vectors pretty much parallel to the initiating boundary, which is the outflow boundary. So that is going to all foster a pretty wicked MCS going into the afternoon and evening hours tonight that is going to pack a punch. When you have strong instability like this, steep lapse rates aloft, that is going to allow for some strong downdrafts in these storms. So that is going to foster a pretty significant damaging wind risk with the MCS as it moves off to the east into the Midwest and Great Lakes region this evening. Take a look at some model data here real quick. This is the 12Z NAM that has come in this morning, so our most recent model run. Start out at 500 millibars here. There is our trough across the northern tier of the country. Again, very low amplitude feature, but it is going to come down into the northern portion, the upper Midwest, into the Great Lakes region. Still very much a more zonal flow regime, but you see a little bit of that ripple in the flow will be just enough to initiate storms in this environment. Going down to the surface, let's take a look at our surface here. So let me zoom into our Midwest sector here. So again, just a broad surface low, not really expecting a big tightening of the surface low today because again, we just don't have that very deep digging trough. I'll zoom back out here just for a second so we can see things a little bit better. But here we are at 4 p.m., a little bit of that surface low up here across far eastern Minnesota into northwest Wisconsin. A little bit more veered flow down to the south here. You'll notice at the surface there, winds out of the south-southwest instead of what we have right now, just along to the north of the boundary. They're out of the east-southeast. We'll have to watch how that plays out. If the winds do veer a little bit at the surface, we could see a little bit less low-level shear, but again, I have a hunch that we'll kind of stick with this kind of surface pattern going into the afternoon, where we have a little bit more backflow just on the north side of the boundary, which will allow for a little bit stronger low-level shear and that tornado threat focused along that outflow boundary. But temperature is going to get up into the 90s. I think this is the NAM being a little bit too cool with the surface temperatures up in here, but you see, you kind of can see those 90s creeping up into central Iowa, western Illinois. I do think we're going to get pretty well into the 90s, a little bit farther to the north, which is going to allow that instability to really increase as we go into the afternoon today. Our moisture is plentiful, 70s dew points here. The corn is high in this region, so that's going to help also bump up those dew points just a little bit, but still we don't really need the help today. Very robust low-level moisture, and especially along that boundary, we can see some 80-degree readings here across Iowa into Illinois. Those kind of mauve colors right there, those are your 80-degree dew points. That is extremely robust low-level moisture, and so that coupled the increase in dew points, especially pooled along the outflow boundary there, along with the rising temperatures into the 90s later today, that is going to again foster a real growth of the instability going into the afternoon. But look at that, just 80-degree dew points right along that outflow boundary. Very thick low-level moisture there. It's going to feel like an absolute sauna outside with temperatures in the mid-90s and dew points in the low 80s. That is going to be very oppressive heat and humidity out there today. But let's take a couple of soundings here. We'll take some soundings initially across eastern Iowa, just ahead of where storms are expected to fire, because your main forcing is kind of right in this region as well. And so we're expecting storms to fire kind of right along that boundary in central to eastern Iowa. Here's our initial profile. You can see that the instability has skyrocketed from the morning, even though we started out very robust in the instability department. The NAM forecasting over 6,200 joules per kilogram mixed layer K. Very thick instability profile here. Strong low-level instability as well, 92 over 81. That is incredible, an incredibly thick, juicy, low-level atmosphere. Plenty of fuel for severe storms to work with. Now, low-level shear is going to be on the weaker side. We don't see those winds really strengthening much as you go up into the atmosphere, but we do see a modest strengthening of the winds in the mid to upper levels of the atmosphere from about 20 knots right now this morning to about 40 knots or so come mid-afternoon, and that is going to allow for deep layer shear to increase, so we'll have plenty of deep layer shear to support severe storm development. Low-level shear is on the weaker side. We do see some veering of the low-level winds with height, effective storm relative helicity in excess of 200 meters squared per second squared, but somewhat weak-looking photographs here, so any supercells perhaps might be a little bit in the high precipitation department given fairly weak mid and upper level shear. We do have deep layer shear again at about 40 knots, but you can see that the hodograph kind of folds in on itself right here. Not those long, lengthy hodographs we like to see for a more classic or low precipitation supercell mode. Very limited mid and upper level shear. That is going to allow for perhaps more high precipitation supercells in the initial portion of the convective life cycle. And they will be supercells given deep layer shear about 40 knots, but again, they might be a little bit HP, and we're expecting a very quick transition to a more messy linear mode here with this setup. So mostly we should see a large hail threat, large hail damaging wind threat with the initial supercells. We could see some tornado threat with any supercell that can anchor to that outflow boundary. But again, upscale growth is expected to occur almost immediately, I would say. Not much of a window for discrete supercells. So we are expecting that upscale growth to occur fairly rapidly after the storms first go up. Let's go to 0Z here, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. We'll take a sounding there in eastern Iowa, and one maybe over here into northern Illinois ahead of this potential MCS. So here we are, eastern Iowa, and you can see just an extremely favorable profile for robust severe weather. Incredible instability, still hanging in the low 6,000s there as far as mixed layer Cape goes. Dew point still in the 80s up there as we go towards sunset. Low-level shear does increase just a little bit. You can see a little bit of veering and strengthening of those low-level winds as we go into the early evening hours there. A little bit more curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph. So that could foster a little bit of a tornado threat, especially again along that boundary where low-level shear is locally enhanced. But again, by this time, we should see a full-fledged MCS that has developed, and that will foster more of a damaging wind threat. Again, strong instability, steep lapse rates aloft, going to foster strong downdrafts and momentum transport down to the surface. A little bit stronger flow aloft gets transported down to the surface. And also the other processes associated with that instability going to really accelerate those downdrafts and have very strong winds reach the surface, especially as outflows conglomerate into one kind of mass of outflow. We should see very strong winds associated with that MCS. Northern Illinois, much of the same, very strong instability, steep lapse rates aloft, with some curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, 300 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. So we should see a few circulations develop within the QLCS itself that should have some tornado threat with them. And then that is expected to persist for quite a while, given a very moist, unstable atmosphere well downstream. If we just put up our instability map here real quick, you can see a very broad sector of an unstable, uncapped air mass going into the evening hours. So that MCS is expected to travel along this boundary for quite some time here. Would not expect this to die off anytime soon. So we could see some derecho potential with this MCS after it develops. We'll just have to see how long it can persist. But given a very broad swath in the west to east direction of a robustly unstable, moist air mass, we should see that MCS persist well into the evening hours, going into northern Illinois, far southern Wisconsin, including the Chicago Metroplex. Chicago Metro needs to be on alert for significant damaging winds in excess of 70 to possibly 80 plus miles an hour with some spin-up tornado risk. I know there was a tornado warning yesterday in Chicago. Could be a repeat of that today in the Chicago metro area. And then we move on perhaps into Indiana, perhaps into parts of western Ohio. SBC has that risk going all the way over to kind of northeast Indiana, southwest Michigan, but would not be surprised to see this persist a little bit farther into parts of western Ohio. So let's take a look at some convection allowing model data to close things out here. This is our 12Z HER run, and you can see what happens here pretty clearly. We get storm initiation by about 21Z there across central Iowa, right along that boundary. HER not depicting a lot of northward advance of the boundary. Storms fire right there in central Iowa, perhaps just northeast of the Des Moines area. And then you can see they quickly grow kind of into a clustered, a more messy mode very quickly. That's 21Z right at initiation, 22Z 5 p.m., very clustered linear mode, and then by 23Z, full-fledged MCS ongoing across eastern Iowa, southwest Wisconsin, far northwest Illinois, and then we get a further filling in of the radar there as we go into northern Illinois. This is when things should really start to ramp up as we get a full-fledged MCS, very strong outflow production from these storms that could produce some 70, 80, 90 mile an hour plus wind gusts here. Moves into the Chicago metro. Sometime here, the HER has it about 2Z or so. That's 9 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Leading edge of the MCS makes it toward the Chicago metroplex, but could be a little bit earlier, could be a little bit later. Not quite sure on the timing yet. So anytime as we go, after 5, 6 p.m., definitely need to be on alert there in the Chicagoland area for that significant damaging wind and tornado risk. But this is a mean-looking MCS here, far-reaching MCS from kind of southwest Iowa all the way into the Lake Michigan there. So a very robust MCS with strong damaging winds and a tornado threat on the leading edge of the line. Continues across the lake going into Michigan, Indiana, very strong winds there. And it does start to eventually dissipate a little bit and kind of break up as we go toward the midnight, early morning hours of tomorrow. But we still see several strong storms along this line here. And the models don't do a very good job in the maintenance and persistence of these complexes. So very well could see a full-fledged line here, still ongoing by early Tuesday morning. We're just not quite sure yet. But anyone from Illinois into Indiana, even Ohio, even southeast Michigan, Detroit, definitely needs to be on alert. Cleveland even could need to be on alert there for damaging winds and some low-end tornado risk going into the overnight hours tonight. So that's the HRRR. Let's take a look at the ARW here. Probably going to show the same story. Pretty cut and dry setup for today. Interestingly, some stronger storms up here across parts of Minnesota into northern Wisconsin. The SPC does have a marginal risk up there, but this particular model is showing some stronger storms up in that region. Again, the robust air mass does reach up that far. We have 60s to 70s dew points all the way up into north central Wisconsin. So not out of the question ahead of this trough coming in to see a few strong severe storms up here with some large hail and perhaps damaging wind risk up there. But again, our main threat is going to be along this boundary in Iowa, Illinois, and areas off to the east, where those storms are expected to fire by mid-afternoon. So the initiation about 4 p.m., kind of close to the Des Moines metro area, maybe just north of Des Moines there on this particular model, quickly growing into a clustered, more linear mode. And then by early evening, very much a full-fledged MCS moving toward the Chicago area into northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin. So places like Madison, Milwaukee, down to Chicago. On alert, as you go toward dinner time tonight, definitely be on alert for that significant damaging wind and tornado threat. But full-fledged, mean-looking MCS there persists well across the lake into Indiana, Michigan, and even into parts of Ohio into the early morning hours tomorrow. NSSL WRF model. One last one here we'll take a look at. Very much a similar situation here. Very quick transition to a more linear complex there. Very mean MCS. This is expected to pack some pretty significant damaging winds. Would not be surprised to see some reports approaching 100 miles an hour with this complex, given strong outflow with these storms and perhaps a rear inflow jet developing. We won't get too much into the MCS structure here, but kind of bows out here, you'll notice, across northern Illinois. And in these bows is where we tend to have stronger winds compared to elsewhere in the line. And that looks to take aim pretty well at the Chicago metroplex there by about 8 to 9 p.m., perhaps a little earlier, perhaps a little later, but anytime after 5 to 6 p.m., definitely be on alert there, as we could see some very significant damaging winds coming through. It's very likely that we'll see significant damaging winds coming through northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, including places like Madison, Milwaukee, and Chicago. And then this model persists that line well into Michigan and Indiana and into Ohio into the morning hours tomorrow morning. So all in all, a very potent severe weather setup is on tap for today, especially across the enhanced risk region here, once again, from kind of central Iowa, eastward into the northern half of Illinois, far southern Wisconsin into parts of northwest Indiana, southwest Michigan. Significant damaging winds are going to be the main risk, as we talked about. Very potent setup for significant damaging winds as those outflows converge, as the storms kind of line out, as well as some of those MCS characteristics, a rear inflow jet and perhaps a bowing structure, a bow echo structure here moving into what looks like northern Illinois, taking aim at the Chicagoland area. By early this evening, we could see that significant damaging wind threat roll right through the Chicago area, and it's becoming fairly likely given the model consistency that we're seeing this morning. So damaging winds, significant damaging winds, 70, 80, 90 plus mile an hour winds are possible within that complex, and also a few tornadoes. Again, mostly expecting to be a damaging wind threat given a quick transition to a more linear storm mode. But we could see a few spin-up tornadoes along the line, along the leading edge of the line, especially where the line interacts with the outflow boundary draped across this region. Again, expecting them to trim this 5% area down a little bit as we go into the afternoon and we get subsequent outlooks to come out. But for now, a little bit of uncertainty where the exact location of the boundary will be is has led to a little bit wider 5% than maybe what we'll see going into the afternoon with some subsequent outlooks. But a tornado threat is evident here, especially along that boundary for parts of eastern Iowa into the northern half of Illinois especially. Large hail is expected also in the first hour or so of the convective life cycle before things merge into a line. So those initial supercells along the boundary, we could see a few large hail reports from that region. So all in all, a very potent setup here. Even places like Des Moines and then over especially toward the areas in the orange here. So even though Des Moines, Milwaukee, not in the enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk, definitely be on alert. Could certainly see an enlarging of the enhanced risk going into the afternoon for significant damaging winds, and the MCS is likely to impact those areas, especially Milwaukee down to Madison, southern Wisconsin. Significant damaging winds are likely there, but definitely Peoria up to Chicago, especially Chicago Metro. The entire Chicago Metro is likely to see some pretty significant damaging winds and a tornado threat with the line as it comes through this evening. And we could see that derecho potential come to fruition if the complex can make it off into Indiana and perhaps Ohio, southeast Michigan, Detroit even, going into the early morning hours tomorrow morning. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.